The neon sign of the Broken Spoke Saloon buzzed with the rhythmic hum of a dying insect against the violet Texas twilight, casting long crimson shadows across the dusty parking lot where pickup trucks outnumbered sedans 10 to 1. Inside those weathered walls, the air was thick with the scent of sawdust, stale beer, and the kind of heartache that only a steel guitar could articulate. It was a place where a man's worth was measured by the firmness of his handshake and the honesty in his eyes. A sanctuary where the ghosts of country music legends seemed to dance in the rafters among the cigarette smoke of yesteryear. It was the kind of place where George Strait belonged, where his soul felt at home, rooted in the cracked leather of a bar stool and the familiar scrape of boots on a hardwood floor. But on this particular Sunday afternoon, the king of country was miles away from the comfort of the Spoke, trapped in a world that felt as artificial as a polyester suit. The camera pulls back from the memory of the honky-tonk to reveal the stark, sterile reality of the Royal Pines Country Club. The contrast is violent. Here the air does not smell of sawdust. It smells of aggressive air conditioning and chemically treated golf course grass. There is no steel guitar, only the hushed, polite clinking of silver spoons against bone china and the low murmur of business deals being struck by men who have never dug a post hole in their lives. George Strait sat alone in a high-backed velvet armchair that felt like a trap, positioned in the corner of the VIP lounge. At 72 years old, he remained a figure of quiet dignity, dressed in his signature starch-stiffened Wrangler jeans and a button-down shirt so crisp it could cut paper. His resistol hat sat on the mahogany table in front of him, a silent sentinel guarding his personal space. He was not here for leisure. He was waiting for a land developer who was 40 minutes late, a meeting he had only agreed to because it concerned the preservation of a property boundary near his ranch. But as the minutes ticked by on the oversized modern clock on the wall, business was the furthest thing from his mind. George looked down at his hands. They were large, capable hands, weathered by decades of roping steers and strumming guitars, mapped with the scars of a life fully lived. In his left palm, a sleek, modern iPhone rested like an alien artifact. It was too thin, too slippery, and entirely too complicated for a man who preferred the tactile certainty of a bridle. He hated the device. He hated how it demanded attention, how it buzzed and chirped, interrupting the silence he had come to cherish. But today the device had done something that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. A notification had popped up on the screen, a cheerful automated message from the WhatsApp application that read simply, "Memories from 4 years ago." His thumb hovered over the glass screen. 4 years ago. The timeline was a physical blow. 4 years ago, the house was still full of noise. 4 years ago, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee in the mornings. 4 years ago, Norma was there. Norma, with her laugh that could clear the clouds from a stormy sky. Norma, who had been his compass, his anchor, and his sail for over 50 years. Since she had passed, George had walked through life with a limp in his soul, a quiet, pervasive emptiness that no amount of applause or platinum records could fill. He had thought he lost all her voice messages in a software update 6 months ago. The technician at the store had apologized, shrugging his shoulders as if deleting a wife's voice was the same as losing a grocery list. George had driven home that day in silence, feeling a grief so fresh it nearly doubled him over. But now the phone was offering him a ghost. He tapped the notification. The application opened, the screen bright and glaring in the dim lounge. His eyes, squinting slightly without his reading glasses, scanned the chat history. There it was. A file labeled Norma. 2020. It was an audio message. He didn't remember it. The date stamped on the file corresponded to a week he had been away on tour, a rare separation during a time when her health had been fluctuating. His finger trembled. The sheer physical reaction angered him. He was George Strait. He had stood before millions, he had ridden bucking horses, yet here he was, shaking like a leaf because of a digital file. He wanted to press play, but a wave of panic washed over him. What if it wasn't her? What if it was just static, or worse, what if it was her voice sounding in pain? He needed to hear it, but he was terrified of the sound. While George battled his internal storm, the atmosphere in the lounge began to shift. A group of 4 young men entered, bringing with them a cloud of loud voices and arrogance. They were the new breed of Texas elite, tech entrepreneurs and hedge fund managers who wore cowboy boots that had never touched dirt and hats that cost more than a good horse. Leading the pack was a man named Brad, 30 years old, with a jawline that looked purchased and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Brad scanned the room, looking for the best table, the one by the window that offered the view of the 18th hole. It was the table right next to George. Brad threw his jacket over a chair and signaled for a waiter with a snap of his fingers that echoed sharply in the room. His friends laughed at something he said, a joke about a merger that destroyed a small company. They sat down, their movements expansive, taking up as much space as possible. George shifted in his seat, trying to make himself smaller, trying to shield his phone and his moment from their intrusion. He just wanted to listen. He just wanted 1 minute of connection with Norma. But the signal in the club was terrible. A small spinning circle appeared on the screen of his phone. Loading. The audio file wouldn't play. "Come on," George whispered, his voice a rough rasp. "Come on, darling. Work for me." He tapped the screen again, harder this time, his frustration mounting. The technology was failing him. The spinning circle mocked him. He held the phone up, moving it slightly to the left, trying to catch a better signal from the Wi-Fi routers he didn't understand. At the next table, Brad noticed the movement. He turned his head, his eyes landing on George. He didn't see the king of country. He didn't see a living legend. He saw an old man in denim in a room full of Italian wool. He saw a relic. "Look at this," Brad said, his voice pitched loud enough to be heard. "We got a fossil trying to figure out how to use a telegraph machine." His friends snickered, glancing over their shoulders. George heard them. The words stung, but not because of the insult to his intelligence. They stung because they were an intrusion on a sacred ritual. He ignored them, his eyes glued to the loading bar that had moved a fraction of an inch. Brad, emboldened by his friend's laughter and the old man's lack of response, leaned back in his chair, swirling the ice in his scotch. He hated being ignored. In his world, when he spoke, people jumped. "Hey, Pops," Brad called out. "You trying to call the nursing home, tell them you escaped?" George's jaw tightened. The muscles in his forearm flexed as he gripped the phone. He took a deep breath, the scent of Norma's perfume haunting his memory, calming him. He wouldn't engage. He was here for her. He needed to hear this message. It felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, and he was not going to let a boy in a suit cut the rope. The waiter approached Brad's table, looking nervous. He recognized George, or at least he recognized the aura of the man, even if he couldn't place the face immediately. "Can I get you gentlemen anything else?" the waiter asked, trying to block their view of George. "Yeah," Brad said, gesturing with his glass towards George. "You can get us some privacy. Maybe clear out the riffraff. This is a private club, isn't it? I didn't know we were allowing ranch hands in the VIP lounge." The waiter went pale. "Sir, that gentleman is a member. He's waiting for—" "I don't care who he's waiting for," Brad interrupted, his voice turning icy. He's staring at his phone like a zombie and muttering to himself. "It's disturbing my guests. Tell him to move, or help him fix his jitterbug phone so he can leave." George lowered the phone slowly. The loading circle was still spinning. The download was stuck at 90%. He felt a surge of helplessness that was foreign to him. He could handle a wild stallion. He could handle a stadium of 50,000 screaming fans. But he couldn't handle this tiny spinning circle and the disrespect of a man who didn't know the meaning of the word. He felt the weight of his age, the weight of his loss. Without Norma, the world seemed to have gotten sharper, colder and louder. She was the one who handled the social conflicts. She was the one who would have put a hand on his arm and made a joke that would have diffused the tension. Without her, he was just a cowboy with a broken heart and a bad signal. "Excuse me," George said. His voice was low, a deep baritone that rumbled through the floorboards, instantly silencing the chatter at Brad's table. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Brad turned, surprised that the statue had spoken. "I'm just trying to retrieve a message," George continued, turning his gaze fully onto Brad. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled with smile lines, were dark and intense. "It's important. I'll be out of your hair in a minute." Brad blinked, taken aback for a second, but his ego quickly recovered. A message? What, did you forget your PIN number? Look, buddy, go to your tech support in the lobby. We're trying to have a celebration here. George looked at the phone again. 95%. He was so close. He could almost hear her breathing. He felt a desperation rising in his throat, a thick, choking sensation. He didn't want to fight. He was too tired to fight. He just wanted to hear her say his name one more time. Please, George said, and the word hung in the air, heavy with a vulnerability that was painful to witness. Just a minute. Brad laughed. It was a cruel, sharp sound. Please, oh, that's rich, the cowboy says. Please, listen, old-timer, time is money, and you're wasting our view. Brad stood up, adjusting his cuffs, preparing to escalate the situation, to assert his dominance over the room. He took a step toward George's table. The waiter stepped forward to intervene, but Brad pushed past him. Let me help you, Brad sneered, reaching out as if to grab the phone from the table. Maybe I can find the off button for you. George's hand shot out. It moved with the speed of a rattlesnake strike, clamping around Brad's wrist. It wasn't an aggressive squeeze, but it was immovable. It was the grip of a man who had held on to bucking broncos and hauled hay bales since he was a boy. Brad froze, his eyes widening in shock. He tried to pull his arm back, but he couldn't. He was tethered to the old man. Don't touch it, George said softly. The menace was gone, replaced by a profound, terrifying sadness. Just don't. He released Brad's wrist. Brad stumbled back, rubbing his arm, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. The lounge had gone deadly silent. Every eye was on them. You're crazy, Brad muttered, retreating to the safety of his group. You're a crazy old man. George didn't answer. He looked down at the screen. The spinning circle stopped. The bar turned green. Download complete. The world seemed to stop spinning. The air conditioning hum faded away. The laughter of the golfers outside vanished. There was only George and the play button. He didn't care about Brad. He didn't care about the waiter. He didn't care about the meeting. His finger, shaking more violently now, moved to the screen. He needed to be careful. He wanted to hold the phone to his ear, to keep the sound for himself, to hoard her voice like a miser hoards gold. But his hands were trembling so badly that he fumbled. Instead of lifting the phone, his thumb slipped. He hit the speakerphone icon, and then, immediately, the play button. The volume was set to maximum. A burst of static crackled through the quiet lounge, loud and jarring. Brad opened his mouth to make another snide comment about the noise, but the words died in his throat. Because suddenly, a voice filled the room. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. It was warm, rich, and unmistakably Texan. It cut through the pretension of the Royal Pines Country Club like a warm knife through butter. It was the sound of a kitchen on a rainy Sunday. It was the sound of comfort. George, the voice said. George Strait closed his eyes. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped from beneath his closed lids and began a slow, tortuous journey down his cheek. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on his hand, his body curling around the phone as if to protect it from the world. The voice continued, broadcasting to every corner of the room, echoing off the expensive wood paneling. George, honey, I know you're worried about this surgery. I can see it in those eyes of yours, even when you try to hide it under that hat. The room was frozen. The young men at Brad's table stopped drinking. The waiter stood with a tray of drinks, unmoving. The authenticity of the recording was overwhelming. It wasn't a business call. It wasn't a transaction. It was pure, unadulterated love, captured in digital amber. You always try to be the strong one. The cowboy who rides away, the voice teased gently, a soft laugh bubbling up that sounded like music. But you don't have to be strong for me. I'm the tough one, remember? I'm the one who put up with you in the road for 50 years. George's shoulders began to shake. It started as a subtle tremor and quickly escalated into a racking sob. He made no sound, but his body betrayed the devastation happening inside him. He was crumbling. The king was crumbling. I just wanted to leave this for you, just in case the good Lord decides he needs a new angel in the choir a little early, the voice said, and the playfulness dropped, replaced by a thick emotional sincerity. I want you to know that you were the best part of my life, George. Every mile, every song, every sunset, it was all you. Brad sat down slowly. His arrogance was evaporating, replaced by a strange, uncomfortable feeling in his chest. He looked at the old man he had just mocked. He saw the way George's hand clutched the table, the knuckles white. He saw the raw, open wound of grief that no amount of money could fix. "Don't you dare stop singing, George," Norma's voice commanded, fierce and loving. "And don't you dare let the cows out. I made a pot of that chili you like. It's in the freezer. You heat it up, you hear me? Don't just eat sandwiches." A pause. A long, heavy pause in the recording where only her breathing could be heard. "So I love you, my stubborn old cowboy. I love you more than there are stars in the Texas sky. I'll be waiting for you, whether it's tomorrow or 20 years from now. I'll be right there." The recording ended with a soft click. The silence that followed was louder than the audio had been. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. George Strait did not move. He remained bowed over the table, his face hidden, his body heaving with silent sobs. He was completely exposed. The armor of the legend was gone, leaving only the man who missed his wife with a ferocity that terrified everyone watching. Brad stared at his own hands. He looked at his expensive watch. Suddenly it seemed incredibly stupid. He looked at his friends, and he saw the same look of shame reflected in their faces. They had just witnessed something holy, and they had been throwing stones at the temple. The waiter placed the tray down on a nearby service stand, the glasses rattling slightly. He wiped his own eye with the back of his hand. George took a ragged breath. It sounded like a saw cutting through wood. He reached for a napkin and pressed it to his eyes, keeping his head down. He was trying to reassemble himself, trying to pull the pieces of his composure back together, but the voice had undone him. It was the mention of the chili, the mundane, everyday detail of her love. It was too much. Brad felt a nudge from one of his friends. "Let's go," the friend whispered. We shouldn't be here." But Brad couldn't move. He was transfixed by the image of the grieving man. He realized with a sudden sinking clarity that he had never been loved like that. He had girlfriends, he had shallow relationships based on status and net worth, but he had never had someone worry about whether he would eat chili after they were gone. He was rich in dollars, but a pauper in the currency that mattered to the man weeping at the next table. George finally lifted his head. His eyes were red, rimmed with the evidence of his pain. He didn't look at the room. He looked at the phone, treating it with a reverence one might show to a religious relic. He tapped the screen with a trembling finger, locking the phone, ensuring the voice was safe. He took a long, shaky breath, adjusting his hat, placing it back on his head. The shadow of the brim hid his eyes again, restoring a fraction of his mystery. He looked at the empty chair across from him, the chair where the land developer should have been. He stood up. The movement drew Brad's attention. Brad stood up too, instinctively. He didn't know why. It was a reflex of respect he didn't know he possessed. George turned to leave. He had to pass Brad's table to get to the exit. The tension was palpable. Would he lash out? Would he demand an apology? George stopped. He looked at Brad. The anger was gone from George's face. In its place was a look of profound pity. He looked at Brad not as an enemy, but as a boy who had a lot to learn about the cost of living. "You take care, son," George said, his voice thick but steady. "Hold on to the ones you got. The signal doesn't always come through when you need it." George tipped his hat, a gesture of old-world manners that felt like a judgment and a blessing all at once. He walked past them, his boots echoing on the polished floor, a slow, steady rhythm. Brad stood there, speechless. The waiter approached George as he neared the door. "Mr. Strait," the waiter asked softly, "your meeting?" George didn't break his stride. "Tell him I went home," he said. "I got better company waiting for me in the freezer." The doors of the Royal Pines Country Club swung shut behind him, leaving the lounge in a silence that no one dared to break. Brad sat back down, but he didn't pick up his drink. He picked up his phone. He stared at it for a long moment, then opened his contacts. He scrolled past the business associates, past the brokers, until he found a number labeled Mom. He hesitated, then pressed call. Outside, the Texas heat hit George like a physical weight, but it felt good. It felt real. He walked to his truck, a white Chevy Silverado that had mud on the tires. He climbed in, the leather seat groaning under his weight. He sat there for a moment, the engine silent. He wasn't alone anymore. The emptiness in the passenger seat didn't feel so vast. He plugged the phone into the dashboard. He didn't play the message again, he didn't need to. It was burned into his heart now. He started the engine, the rumble of the V8 comforting him. As he pulled out of the pristine, paved lot of the country club and turned onto the road that would lead him back to the dirt and the dust, he whispered into the cab of the truck, "I'll heat up the chili, Norma, I promise." The sun began to dip below the horizon, setting the Texas sky on fire with oranges and purples, colors that no painter could ever truly capture. George Strait drove west, towards the ranch, towards the memory, leaving the hollow luxury of the club behind in the rearview mirror. The highway stretched out before the hood of the white Chevy Silverado, like a gray ribbon unspooling into the heart of the Texas hill country. The sun had finally surrendered to the horizon, leaving behind a bruised sky of deep indigo and burnt orange, the colors of a bruise healing on the skin of the world. Inside the cab, the silence was absolute, save for the low, steady hum of the tires on the asphalt and the rhythmic thrum of the engine, a mechanical heartbeat that George Strait found more comforting than any human voice at that moment. He drove with one hand on the wheel, his grip loose but assured, a muscle memory honed over 50 years of driving from gig to gig, from ranch to rodeo. His other hand rested on the center console, fingers lightly brushing the edge of the iPhone. The device was dark now, the screen black, but it felt heavy, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the battery and everything to do with the soul captured inside its circuits. George didn't turn on the radio. He couldn't bear the thought of a song, not even one of his own. Music was his life, his trade, his joy, but right now, any melody would feel like an intrusion. He needed to let the echo of Norma's voice settle into his bones. He needed to replay it in his mind, not through the speakers, but through the memory of her. "I made a pot of that chili you like." The words looped in his head, syncing with the passing telephone poles. It was such a simple thing. Chili. It wasn't a grand declaration of undying passion fit for a cinema screen. It wasn't poetry. It was better. It was the language of a marriage that had weathered storms, raised children, buried friends, and built a life out of dirt and dreams. It was the practical love of a woman who knew that grief would make a man forget to eat, who knew that her husband, for all his fame and accolades, was helpless in a kitchen without her guidance. As the city limits of San Antonio faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the sprawling darkness of the ranchlands, George's mind drifted back. The landscape outside the window blurred, and suddenly, it wasn't Sunday evening in 2024. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 2020. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the light in the kitchen that day. It was harsh, filtering through the blinds they hadn't bothered to open fully. The world was shutting down. The news was full of panic, maps turning red, borders closing. But in the Strait household, the fear was more localized, more specific. Norma had been tired. Not the good kind of tired that comes after a day of working the garden, but a deep cellular exhaustion that made her skin look like parchment paper. He was packing a bag, just a small duffel. He had to go up to Nashville for a meeting that couldn't be cancelled, a final obligation before the world locked its doors. He didn't want to go. He remembered standing by the door, his boots feeling like they were filled with lead. "I'll be back in 2 days," he had told her, trying to sound confident, trying to be the cowboy who always had a plan. "Don't you go moving any furniture while I'm gone." Norma was sitting at the kitchen island, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. She looked small. That was what haunted him now, how small she had looked in his big flannel shirt. She had smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were busy memorizing his face. "You take your vitamins, George," she had said, "and wash your hands. Don't be shaking hands with everyone who wants an autograph." He had kissed her on the forehead, the skin cool against his lips. "I'll be careful. You rest. I'll call you when I land." He had walked out the door, gotten in the truck, and driven away. He hadn't seen her pick up her phone. He hadn't seen her press record. He hadn't known that while he was worrying about flight schedules and contracts, she was worrying about eternity. She must have sat there in the quiet house, the tea going cold, and poured her heart into that microphone, knowing what he refused to admit. That time was the one thing they couldn't buy, not with all the platinum records in the world. Back in the present, George let out a shuddering breath. The truck drifted slightly over the yellow line before he corrected it. The guilt was a sharp stone in his gut. He had left. He had come back, of course, and they had had more time. Precious, painful, beautiful time. But he had never known about the message. He had walked around for 4 years with a hole in his heart, not knowing she had left a patch for it right there in his pocket. Meanwhile, back at the Royal Pines Country Club, the atmosphere had not recovered. The air in the VIP lounge remained heavy, charged with the residual static of George's emotional explosion. Brad sat at his table, the ice in his scotch completely melted, watering down the expensive liquor into a pale, unappetizing sludge. His friends, usually a raucous chorus of affirmation for his ego, were silent. They scrolled through their phones aimlessly, avoiding eye contact with each other and, more importantly, with Brad. So, one of them, a guy named Trent, finally said, his voice too loud in the quiet room, "Are we ordering food or what? I'm starving." Brad looked up. He looked at Trent's face, smooth, unlined, devoid of anything resembling depth. He looked at the menu on the table, listing steaks that cost more than a car payment. Suddenly, the opulence of the room felt suffocating. It felt cheap. "I'm not hungry," Brad said, pushing his glass away. "Dude, relax," Trent chuckled nervously. It was just a weird moment. The old guy was clearly losing it. Probably forgot his meds. Don't let it ruin the vibe. "Losing it?" Brad repeated, his voice rising. "Did you hear him? Did you hear that recording?" "Yeah, I heard it," Trent shrugged. "Sad stuff. But hey, people die. It happens. Why are you making a big deal out of it?" Brad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't the alcohol. It was the mirror George Strait had inadvertently held up to him. Brad realized with a terrifying clarity that if he died tomorrow, no one would save a voicemail of his. His ex-girlfriends would check his bank accounts. His business partners would check his equity. His friends would drink a toast and move on to the next table. There would be no chili in the freezer. There would be no stubborn old cowboy. There would just be a void where a bank balance used to be. "I need some air," Brad muttered. He walked out to the balcony overlooking the 18th green. The night air was humid, carrying the scent of cut grass and chlorine from the pool. He gripped the railing, his knuckles turning white. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at the contact. Mom. He hadn't called her in 3 weeks. The last time they spoke, he had cut the call short because he had a tea time. He remembered her voice, small and apologetic, asking if he was eating enough, if he was working too hard. He had been annoyed then. Now the memory of that annoyance felt like a slap in the face. He pressed the call button. The ringing sound seemed to last for hours. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. "Hello?" Her voice was surprised, slightly breathless. She was probably watching her shows. "Hey, Mom," Brad said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to sound like the master of the universe he pretended to be, but failing miserably. "Brad? Is everything okay? It's late. Are you in trouble?" The immediate assumption that he only called when he needed something stung him. "No, Mom, I'm not in trouble. He looked out at the dark golf course, seeing nothing but empty, manicured land. "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a silence on the other end, a confused, worried silence. "Have you been drinking, Bradley?" "A little," he admitted. "But that's not—" "Mom, do you remember that meatloaf you used to make? The one with the brown sugar glaze?" "The meatloaf?" She laughed, a nervous, confused sound. "Bradley, I haven't made that since you were in high school. You said it was peasant food when you came back from college." Brad closed his eyes. He remembered saying that. He remembered the hurt look on her face that she had quickly masked with a smile. He was a monster. He had been a monster for a long time, disguised in a suit. "I was an idiot," Brad whispered. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really liked that meatloaf." "Honey, are you crying?" "No," Brad lied, wiping his face with his silk sleeve. "Listen, I'm going to come visit next weekend, okay? Don't cook anything. I'll bring dinner. We can just sit." "I'd like that, Bradley. I'd like that very much." Brad hung up the phone. He stood there for a long time, looking at the screen. He felt exhausted, stripped raw, but for the first time in years, He felt human. He looked back through the glass doors at the empty table where George Strait had sat. The chair was pushed in, the space was empty, but the lesson remained. Miles away, the white Silverado turned off the main highway and crunched onto the gravel road that led to the ranch gate. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar twisted branches of mesquite trees and the silver flash of a barbed wire fence. George punched the code into the keypad at the gate. The gears ground together, a familiar sound of home, and the iron gates swung open. He drove through, the tires kicking up dust that swirled in the red glow of his taillights. The main house stood on a rise, a sprawling limestone structure that usually welcomed him with the warmth of porch lights. Tonight, it was dark. He hadn't left any lights on. He hadn't expected to be gone this long, and he hadn't expected to come back feeling this heavy. He parked the truck in front of the garage. The engine ticked as it cooled. George sat there for a moment, gathering the strength to go inside. Entering the house alone was always the hardest part of the day. It was the moment the silence stopped being peaceful and started being predatory. He opened the truck door and stepped out. The night air was filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. He walked to the front door, his boots heavy on the flagstones. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. It was faint now, fading with every passing month, but it was still there. A mix of lemon oil, old books, and vanilla. Norma's smell. He didn't turn on the main lights. He navigated by the moonlight spilling through the large windows. He walked through the living room, passing the grand piano that no one played anymore, passing the mantel cluttered with framed photos of smiling faces from decades past. He went straight to the kitchen. The kitchen was the heart of the house. It was a massive room with a butcher block island and copper pots hanging from a rack. It was spotless, sterile. The housekeeper came twice a week to dust and polish, erasing the evidence of life while trying to preserve the memory of it. George tossed his hat onto the counter, a breach of Norma's rules, but she wasn't there to scold him. He walked to the massive stainless steel refrigerator. He stood in front of it, his reflection warped in the brushed metal. "It's in the freezer. You heat it up, you hear me?" He opened the freezer drawer. A blast of cold air hit his legs. The light inside illuminated neat rows of vacuum-sealed meats, bags of frozen vegetables, and boxes of ice cream he shouldn't be eating. He began to dig. He moved a bag of frozen shrimp. He shifted a stack of steaks. He felt a rising panic. What if it wasn't there? What if the housekeeper had thrown it out? What if the audio message was wrong, a confusion of a dying mind? What if he had eaten it a year ago and forgotten? His hands were cold, numb, but he kept moving things, reorganizing the icy strata of his freezer. And then he saw it. Way in the back, pushed behind a bag of frozen corn, was a round Tupperware container. It wasn't vacuum sealed. It wasn't labeled with a label maker. It was wrapped in aluminum foil, crinkled and old. George reached for it. His hand shook as he pulled it out. It was heavy, solid. He set it on the island counter and peeled back the foil. There, written on a piece of masking tape in blue Sharpie, was Norma's handwriting. It was a bit shaky. She must have written it on a bad day, but the loops of her G were unmistakable. George's chili, extra spicy, March 12th, 2020. George stared at the container. The frost on the plastic began to melt in the warmth of the kitchen, turning into droplets of water that looked like tears. March 12th, 2020. The same week as the audio message. She had made this right after she recorded the voice note. She had stood right here in this spot, chopping onions and browning meat, thinking about his hunger when she would no longer be there to satisfy it. She had frozen a meal for a future she knew she wouldn't see. George gripped the edge of the counter. The dam that had cracked at the country club finally broke completely. He didn't sob this time. He just lowered his head onto the cool granite counter, right next to the frozen chili, and let the waves of grief and gratitude wash over him. He wasn't crying for the loss anymore. He was crying for the love, the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of a love that could reach out from 4 years in the past, from beyond the grave, to make sure he had a warm dinner on a lonely Sunday night. "I found it, Norma," he whispered into the empty kitchen, his voice cracking. "I found it, darling." He stood there for a long time, the cold radiating from the container against his cheek. He felt closer to her in that moment than he had since the funeral. The audio message had been her voice, but this plastic tub of frozen chili was her touch. It was her care. It was her saying, "I'm still taking care of you, George. I haven't clocked out yet." He lifted his head and wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at the container. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't hungry, not really, but he had orders. "You heat it up, you hear me?" George walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a small saucepan. He placed it on the stove. He ran the Tupperware under warm water to loosen the block of frozen food. It slid out into the pan with a thud. He turned the burner on low. As the heat began to work on the frozen block, the kitchen began to change. Slowly, subtly, the sterile smell of lemon oil was replaced. The scent of cumin, chili powder, and garlic began to rise. It was the scent of memory. It was the scent of life returning to a mausoleum. George stood by the stove, stirring the melting chili with a wooden spoon. He watched the steam rise, swirling in the moonlight. He felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't just heating up dinner. He was performing a communion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone again. He set it on the counter next to the stove. He didn't play the message. He just looked at the file name. Norma, 2020. He tapped the screen, opening his contacts. He scrolled down. He found the number for his son, Bubba. It was late, almost 10 o'clock, but he needed to hear a living voice now. He needed to pass the torch. He pressed call. "Dad?" Bubba's voice was groggy, filled with sleep. "Everything okay? It's late." "Yeah, Bubba," George said, his voice stronger now, fortified by the smell of the chili. "Everything's fine. I found something of your mom's." "Oh," Bubba sounded more awake now. "What did you find?" "I found her voice," George said, stirring the pot. "And I found dinner. Listen, bring the grandkids over tomorrow. We're going to have a barbecue. I don't want the house to be this quiet anymore." There was a pause on the other end, a happy pause. "We'd love that, Dad. We'd really love that." "Good. And Bubba?" "Yeah, Dad." "Tell your wife you love her tonight. Don't wait until morning." "I will, Dad. Good night." "Good night, son." George hung up. The chili was bubbling now, a thick, rich sound. He turned off the burner. He opened the silverware drawer and took out a spoon. He didn't bother with a bowl. He took the pot off the stove and walked over to the kitchen table, the small one in the breakfast nook where they used to drink coffee, not the big formal dining table. He sat down in his chair. He looked at the empty chair across from him. "Thank you," he said to the empty space. He took a bite. It was spicy. It burned his tongue and warmed his chest. It tasted exactly like 2020. It tasted like her. And in that quiet kitchen, George Strait, the king of country, ate his dinner with a ghost. And for the first time in 4 years, he didn't feel like the cowboy rides away. He felt like the cowboy who had come home. The sun rose over the Lazy G Ranch with a brilliance that felt like a benediction. It wasn't the harsh, blinding glare of the previous day's city sun. This was a soft, golden light that painted the limestone hills in shades of honey and amber. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked sage and the earthy aroma of cattle waking up in the pastures. For the first time in 4 years, the silence of the morning didn't feel empty to George Strait. It felt expectant. He was up before the dawn, a habit from his youth that fame had never managed to break. But instead of the usual somber routine of coffee and staring out the window, the kitchen was alive with activity. The Tupperware container, now washed and dried, sat on the counter like a trophy. It was empty, but it had done its job. It had fueled him. George moved with a renewed purpose. He had pulled a brisket out of the deep freeze the night before, right after the chili, and now he was out by the smokehouse, tending to the fire. The hickory wood crackled and popped, sending spirals of blue smoke into the clear sky. He wasn't wearing the stiff starched shirt of the country club. He was in a worn t-shirt, old jeans stained with oil, and a pair of work boots that had seen more mud than most trucks. He looked younger. The weight that had been pulling his shoulders down towards the earth had lifted, replaced by the steady rhythm of work and the promise of family. By noon, the ranch was transformed. The silence was shattered, not by the beep of medical machines or the ring of business phones, but by the shrieks of children. Bubba had arrived with the grandkids, a whirlwind of energy that swept through the house, opening curtains, turning on lights, and chasing the dogs through the yard. George stood on the porch, a pair of tongs in one hand, watching his grandson try to rope a fence post. The boy missed, tangled the rope, and fell into the grass, laughing. George chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that felt good in his chest. "Keep your elbow up, Harvey," George called out. "It's all in the wrist, not the shoulder." Bubba walked up the steps, holding 2 cold beers. He handed one to his father. "You look good, Dad. Better than I've seen you in a long time." George took the beer, the condensation cold against his palm. "I feel better, son. I had a long talk with your mother last night." Bubba paused, looking at his father carefully. He knew about the audio message, but he didn't know the depth of the communion George had experienced in the kitchen. "Yeah? What did she say?" George smiled, looking out at the horizon where the bluebonnets were just starting to show their color. "She told me to stop worrying about the fences and start feeding the family. She told me she's still watching, and she told me she loves this stubborn old cowboy." Bubba clinked his bottle against George's. "She was always right, Dad." "That she was," George agreed. "That she was." The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew their attention to the main gate. It was a long driveway, winding through the mesquite trees, and a cloud of dust heralded the arrival of a vehicle. George squinted. He wasn't expecting anyone else. The family was all here. As the car emerged from the dust, the contrast was stark. It was a sleek black luxury sedan low to the ground, completely unsuited for the ruts and rocks of a ranch road. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in a pasture. "You expecting company?" Bubba asked, stepping closer to his father, his protective instinct kicking in. "No," George said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not." The car pulled up near the barn, looking ridiculous next to the muddy pickups. The driver's door opened and a young man stepped out. He was wearing a suit, though he had discarded the tie, and his dress shoes were instantly coated in red dust. It was Brad. The young man from the country club looked different in the daylight of the ranch. Without the dim lighting and the alcohol of the VIP lounge, he looked younger, more uncertain. He stood by his car, looking up at the porch where the legend stood. He looked terrified. Bubba started to move down the steps. "I'll handle this. Probably some reporter or a fan who jumped the gate." "Hold on," George said, putting a hand on his son's chest. "I know him." George walked down the steps slowly, his boots thudding on the wood. He walked across the yard, the chickens scattering before him. He stopped 10 feet from Brad. The silence of the ranch stretched between them, heavy and thick. Brad swallowed hard. He fidgeted with a manila folder in his hands. "Mr. Strait," he began, his voice cracking slightly. I hope I'm not intruding. The gate code. The developer gave it to me." George just looked at him. He didn't look angry. He looked curious. "You're a long way from the Royal Pines, son. There's no waiters here to bring you a scotch." Brad flinched at the memory. He looked down at his dusty shoes. "I know. I didn't come for a drink." "What did you come for then?" George asked, crossing his arms. Brad took a deep breath. He looked up, meeting George's eyes. It took every ounce of courage he had. "I came to apologize, truly. For yesterday. For everything." George didn't speak. He let the boy talk. I was a jerk," Brad continued, the words tumbling out now. "I was cruel. And when I heard that recording, when I saw you..." He paused, struggling to control his voice. "I called my mother last night, Mr. Strait. I haven't talked to her in a month. We talked for an hour. She told me about a meatloaf she used to make." A faint smile touched the corner of George's mouth. "Meatloaf, huh?" "Yeah," Brad laughed nervously. "It's not chili, but it's what we had." Brad stepped forward and held out the manila folder. "I also brought this. I work for the firm that represents the developers you were supposed to meet. I looked at the file this morning. They were planning to build an access road right through your south pasture, the one with the creek." George's eyes sharpened. That creek was where he and Norma had picnicked for 40 years. "I know. That's why I was at the meeting." They aren't going to build it, Brad said firmly. I pulled the file. I redrew the easement myself this morning. They can route it around the perimeter. It costs them more money, but it saves your land. It saves the creek. George took the folder. He opened it. There were maps, legal documents, and a new survey line drawn in thick red ink, steering clear of his property. It was a peace offering worth millions, but more importantly, it was a gesture of respect. Why did you do this? George asked, looking up from the papers. You don't owe me anything. I could have handled them. I know you could have, Brad said quietly, but you taught me something yesterday. You taught me that you can have all the money in the bank, but if you don't have a voice to listen to when it gets dark, you're broke. I don't want to be broke anymore, Mr. Strait. I want to be the kind of man who deserves a voicemail. George closed the folder. He looked at the young man, really looked at him. He saw the regret, the humility, and the spark of change. He saw a man trying to mend a fence he had broken. You like brisket? George asked suddenly. Brad blinked, confused by the shift. Yes, sir. I love brisket. Good, George said, because I got about 20 pounds of it smoking back there, and if I leave it to Bubba, he'll dry it out. George turned and began walking back toward the house. He stopped after a few steps and looked back. Brad was still standing by his car, unsure if the invitation was real. Well, George called out, are you coming? Or are you going to stand there and let the flies eat you? A genuine smile broke across Brad's face. He locked his car, a habit he couldn't quite break, and jogged to catch up with the cowboy. The barbecue was a scene that belonged in a frame. The sun was high and warm. The smell of hickory smoke and barbecue sauce filled the air. Brad sat at a picnic table covered in a red checkered cloth, a plate piled high with meat, coleslaw, and potato salad. He was sitting next to Bubba, who was explaining the intricacies of cattle breeding, and for the first time in his adult life, Brad was listening. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't looking for an exit strategy. He was present. George sat at the head of the table. He ate slowly, savoring the food, but mostly savoring the noise, the sound of laughter, of silverware scraping against plates, of stories being told. It was the music of life. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began its descent, turning the sky into a canvas of violent violets and soft pinks, the same colors from the night before, but without the loneliness. Brad stood up to leave. He shook Bubba's hand, then Harvey's. He walked over to George, who was leaning against the porch railing, watching the sunset. Thank you, Mr. Strait, Brad said, for the food and for the second chance. George offered his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and calloused. You're welcome, son. And Brad? Yes, sir. Call your mama again next week. Don't make her wait. I will, sir. I promise. Brad walked to his car. As he drove away, the dust cloud was different. It wasn't an intrusion, it was a departure of a friend. George stayed on the porch as the twilight settled over the ranch. The guests were packing up. Bubba was helping get the kids into the truck. The day was done. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He navigated to the message. He didn't need to play it to know what it said, but he wanted to. He wanted to share the sunset with her. He pressed play, but this time he turned the volume down low, so it was just for him. George, stop worrying about the fences. Come have dinner. I love you, you stubborn old cowboy. George looked out at the south pasture, the one Brad had saved. The creek was catching the last light of the day, shimmering like a silver ribbon. He felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. The grief was still there, a stone in his pocket, but it wasn't pulling him underwater anymore. It was just a part of him, a reminder of how lucky he had been. He looked up at the first star appearing in the vast Texas sky. He tipped his hat to it. I'm listening, Norma, he whispered. I'm listening. He turned off the phone, put it back in his pocket, and turned toward the door where the warm yellow light of the kitchen spilled out onto the porch. He didn't look back at the dark. He walked into the light, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, knowing that as long as he had the memory, he would never truly be riding alone.